The fur trade is a worldwide industry dealing in the acquisition and sale of animal fur. Since the establishment of a world fur market in the early modern period, furs of boreal, polar and cold temperate mammalian animals have been the most valued. Historically, the trade stimulated the exploration and colonization of Siberia, northern North America, and the South Shetland and South Sandwich Islands. Today, the importance of the fur trade has diminished. It is based on pelts produced at fur farms and regulated fur-bearer trapping, but has become controversial. Animal rights organizations oppose the fur trade, citing that animals are brutally killed and sometimes skinned alive. Fur has been replaced in some clothing by synthetic imitations, for example, as in ruffs on hoods of parkas. Russian fur trade. Before the European colonization of the Americas, Russia was a major supplier of fur pelts to Western Europe and parts of Asia. Its trade developed in the early Middle Ages, first through exchanges at posts around the Baltic and Black Seas. The main trading market destination was the German city of Leipzig. Originally, Russia exported raw furs, consisting in most cases of the pelts of martens, beavers, wolves, foxes, squirrels and hares. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, Russians began to settle in Siberia, a region rich in many mammal fur species, such as Arctic fox, lynx, sable, sea otter and stoat, in a search for the prized sea otter pelts, first used in China, and later from the northern fur seal. The Russian Empire expanded into North America, notably Alaska. For the 17th through the second half of the 19th century, Russia was the world's largest supplier of fur. The fur trade played a vital role in the development of Siberia, the Russian Far East and the Russian colonization of the Americas. As recognition of the importance of the trade to the Siberian economy, the sable is a regional symbol of the Ural-Sverdlovsk Oblast and the Siberian Novosibirsk, Tyumen and Irkutsk oblasts of Russia. The European discovery of North America, with its vast forests and wildlife, particularly the beaver, led to the continent becoming a major supplier in the 17th century of fur pelts for the fur felt hat and fur trimming and garment trades of Europe. Fur was relied on to make warm clothing, a critical consideration prior to the organization of coal distribution for heating. Portugal and Spain played major roles in fur trading after the 15th century with the business in fur hats. Siberia from as early as the 10th century, merchants and buyers of Novgorod had exploited the fur resources beyond the portage, a watershed at the White Lake that represents the door to the entire northwestern part of Eurasia. They began by establishing trading posts along the Volga and Vychegda river networks and requiring the Komi people to give them furs as tribute. Novgorod, the chief fur trade center, prospered as the easternmost trading post of the Hanseatic League. Novgorodians expanded farther east and north, coming into contact with the Pekara people of the Pekara River Valley and the Ugra people residing near the Urals. Both of these native tribes offered more resistance than the Komi, killing many Russian tribute collectors throughout the 10th and 11th centuries. As Muscovy gained more power in the 15th century and proceeded in the gathering of the Russian lands, the Muscovite state began to rival the Novgorodians in the north. During the 15th century, Moscow began subjugating many native tribes. One strategy involved exploiting antagonisms between tribes, notably the Komi and Ugra, by recruiting men of one tribe to fight in an army against the other tribe. Campaigns against native tribes in Siberia remained insignificant until they began on a much larger scale in 1483 and 1499. Besides the Novgorodians and the indigenes Muscovites also had to contend with the various Muslim Tatar Khanates to the east of Muscovy. In 1552, Ivan IV, the Tsar of all the Russias, took a significant step towards securing Russian hegemony in Siberia when he sent a large army to attack the Kosan Tatars and ended up obtaining the territory from the Volga to the Ural Mountains. At this point, the phrase ruler of Obdor, Kondor, and all Siberian lands became part of the title of the Tsar in Moscow. Even so, problems ensued after 1558 when Ivan IV sent Grigory Stroganov to colonize land on the Kama and to subjugate and usurp the Komi living there. The Stroganov family soon came into conflict with the Khan of Siberia, whose land they encroached on. Ivan told the Stroganovs to hire Cossack mercenaries to protect the new settlement from the Tatars. From California 1581, the band of Cossacks led by Yermak Timofeyevich fought many battles that eventually culminated in a Tatar victory and the temporary end to Russian occupation in the area. In 1584, Ivan's son fired or sent military governors and soldiers to reclaim Yermak conquests and officially to annex the land held by the Khanate of Siberia. Similar skirmishes with Tatars took place across Siberia as Russian expansion continued. Russian conquerors treated the natives of Siberia as easily exploited enemies who were inferior to them. As they penetrated deeper into Siberia, traders built outposts or winter lodges called Zimovia where they lived and collected fur tribute from native tribes. By 1620, Russia dominated the land from the Urals eastward to the Yenisei Valley and to the Altai Mountains in the south, comprising about 1.25 million square miles of land. Furs would become Russia's largest source of wealth during the 16th and 17th centuries. Keeping up with the advances of Western Europe required significant capital, and Russia did not have sources of gold and silver, but it did have furs, which became known as soft gold and provided Russia with hard currency. The Russian government received income from the fur trade through two taxes: the Yasyk tax on natives and the 10% sovereign tithing tax imposed on both the catch and sale of fur pelts. Fur was in great demand in Western Europe, especially sable and marten, since European forest resources had been overhunted and furs had become extremely scarce. Fur trading allowed Russia to purchase from Europe goods that it lacked, like lead, tin, precious metals, textiles, firearms, and sulfur. Russia also traded furs with Ottoman Turkey and other countries in the Middle East in exchange for silk, textiles, spices, and dried fruit. The high prices that sable, black fox, and marten furs could generate in international markets spurred a fur fever in which many Russians moved to Siberia as independent trappers. From 1585 to 1680, tens of thousands of sable and other valuable pelts were obtained in Siberia each year. The primary way for the Muscovite state to obtain furs was by exacting a fur tribute from the Siberian natives, called a yasyk. Yasyk was usually a fixed number of sable pelts which every male tribe member who was at least 15 years old had to supply to Russian officials. Officials enforced yasyk through coercion and by taking hostages, usually the tribe chiefs or members of the chief's family. At first, Russians were content to trade with the natives, exchanging goods like pots, axes, and beads for the prized sables that the natives did not value. But greater demand for furs led to violence and force becoming the primary means of obtaining the furs. The largest problem with the yasyk system was that Russian governors were prone to corruption because they received no salary. They resorted to illegal means of getting furs for themselves, including bribing customs officials to allow them to personally collect yasyk. extorting natives by exacting yasik multiple times over, or requiring tribute from independent trappers. Russian fur trappers, called pромышленники, hunted in one of two types of bands of 10 to 15 men, called vatagi. The first was an independent band of blood relatives or unrelated people who contributed an equal share of the hunting expedition expenses. The second was a band of hired hunters who participated in expeditions fully funded by the trading companies which employed them. Members of an independent vatagi cooperated and shared all necessary work associated with fur trapping, including making and setting traps, building forts and camps, stockpiling firewood and grain, and fishing. All fur pelts went into a common pool that the band divided equally among themselves after Russian officials exacted the tithing tax. On the other hand, a trading company provided hired fur trappers with the money needed for transportation, food, and supplies. And once the hunt was finished, the employer received 2/3 of the pelts and the remaining ones were sold and the proceeds divided evenly among the hired laborers. During the summer, pромышленники would set up a summer camp to stockpile grain and fish, and many engaged in agricultural work for extra money. During late summer or early fall, the vatagi left the hunting grounds, surveyed the area, and set up a winter camp. Each member of the group set at least 10 traps, and the vatagi divided into smaller groups of 2 to 3 men who cooperated to maintain certain traps. Pромышленники checked traps daily, resetting them or replacing bait whenever necessary. The pромышленники employed both passive and active hunting strategies. The passive approach involved setting traps, while the active approach involved the use of hunting dogs and of bows and arrows. Occasionally, hunters also followed sable tracks to the burrows, around which they placed nets, and waited for the sable to emerge. The hunting season began around the time of the first snow in October and November and continued until early spring. Hunting expeditions lasted 2 to 3 years on average, but occasionally longer, because of the long hunting season and the fact that passage back to Russia was difficult and costly. Beginning around the 1650s-1660s, many pромышленники chose to stay and settle in Siberia. From 1620 to 1680, a total of 15,983 trappers operated in Siberia. North American fur trade. The North American fur trade began as early as the 1500s and was a central part of the early history of contact between Europeans and the native peoples of what is now the United States and Canada. In 1578 there were 350 European fishing vessels at Newfoundland. Sailors began to trade metal implements for the natives' well-worn pelts. The first pelts in demand were beaver and sea otter, as well as occasionally deer, bear, ermine and skunk. Fur robes were blankets of sewn-together native tanned beaver pelts. The pelts were called castor gras in French and coat beaver in English, and were soon recognized by the newly developed felt hat-making industry as particularly useful for felting. Some historians, seeking to explain the term castor gras, have assumed that coat beaver was rich in human oils from having been worn so long, and that this is what made it attractive to the hatters. This seems unlikely, since grease interferes with the felting of wool, rather than enhancing it. By the 1580s, beaver wool was the major starting material of the French felt hatters. Hat makers began to use it in England soon after, particularly after Huguenot refugees brought the skills and tastes with them from France.